much for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Certainly, it isn't every day that people willingly hear about one's thesis. So, usually I'm talking to the dust bunnies. This is a much better crowd. Thank you so much for being here. So I have recently completed this PhD thesis doing a comparative analysis of C.S. Lewis and T.S. Eliot along theological lines, investigating the kind of apophatic qualities of Eliot in contrast to the kind of cataphatic impulse that you see throughout Lewis. And today I'm going to present a kind of a slice of chapter of that basic version, a version of it evaluating specifically how this impulse shows up in their creative works, and how the impulse sort of makes those creative works very kind of qualitatively different. There's a different texture to that attitude towards language. This particular talk within this theme is going to be called Cosmic Summer or Unimaginable Zero Summer, the clash of cataphatic and apophatic visions in the creative works of C.S. Lewis and T.S. Eliot. The paper will examine two competing impulses, Eliot's via negativa renunciatory impulse and Lewis's cataphatic or via positiva impulse, principally as it's reflected in their creative works. The first half will treat Eliot and the consistent presence of apophaticism in his work, which the paper will frame as Eliot's pursuit both of a pure poetic speech and of a pure spirit. It will trace this quality in his poetry from his very early work, including the love song of Jael for Prufrock, all the way through to four quartets. The second half will treat the consistent presence of the cataphatic in Lewis's creative work, focusing most especially on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Last Battle, and The Great Divorce, as well as selections of his poetry. The second half will simultaneously contrast the creative writings of Lewis just mentioned with those of Eliot, and several relevant Lewis-Eliot dichotomies will be proposed: continuity versus discontinuity, enlargement versus annihilation, the goodness or not of ordinary things. We'll endeavor to show how Lewis's vision of cosmic summer, a phrase he used in The Grand Miracle, as we see it unfold in his Narnia tales, differs meaningfully from Eliot's vision of unimaginable zero summer in four quartets. The first section is called From Mermaid Song to Tongues of Fire, Eliot's desire for pure poetic speech. This section will examine the consistent presence in Eliot's poetry from love song to four quartets of a desire first to hear and finally to speak what might be called the language of pure poetry. Eliot desiring to leave behind the prosaic speech of the women who come and go talking of Michelangelo, here's to place all his hope for meaningful utterance in the music or the song of the mermaids. What is more, he appears to locate this language, this music of pure poetry, this song, exclusively in the domain of the transcendent, in a domain, in other words, ever beyond his reach. In four quartets, he says there are things that only the dead can tell you, being dead. He says the communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. They, like the mermaids, belong to an eternal or quasi-eternal realm and speak, therefore, a higher tongue, one which Eliot endeavors to learn, even as he acknowledges where his own words crack and sometimes break. This talk will explore Eliot's pursuit of this pure poetry in relation to the theology of the via negativa. It will focus on the first and last of Eliot's major poems, Prufrock and four quartets, the alpha and omega of his oeuvre, in order to make explicit the radical continuity between his end and his beginning. Eliot, reflecting on the role of the poet, writes in Little Gidding, since our concern was speech, speech impelled us to purify the dialect of the tribe. Appropriately, The element of fire predominates in this poem, in the figure of the dove descending, the effable fires of war and the ineffable fire of the Holy Spirit intermingle as if to cooperate in burning away all that can be burnt away, to leave behind only that which is durable and enduring. A Pentecostal poem, language is its chief subject, the clarification of language its chief concern. And Eliot's desire for a purified speech, for a fiery tongue beyond that of the living, is expressed, though crucially never realized within the poem. Such resolution lies beyond the end of the poem because beyond the capacity of words, which decay with imprecision. Ultimate realities cannot be grasped, but can only be gestured at with words, which slip, slide, and perish beneath the burden of attempts to contain and transmit the eternal. Just as he says, humankind cannot bear very much reality, neither can words in T.S. Eliot's way of thinking. Both are fallible. In this great limitation, they are twin. They are, to borrow a line from The Wasteland, which Eliot borrows from Baudelaire, semblable, frère. Each is a kind of shabby equipment that is always deteriorating. In The Wasteland, as in Little Gidding, ultimate relief exists only in potential. In the former, restorative water is promised, in the latter, a vitalizing fire. But under the appearance of either element, it is the same animating spirit that is delayed, in the absence of which things remain in hopeful suspension, albeit as disparate pieces awaiting coordination into coherent wholes. In Little Gidding, the desired conclusion may only occur when, at a moment outside of time, the fire and the rose are one, as he writes. Then conditions will at last be propitious. But long before Eliot burns into our imaginations his consummating image of the crowned knot of fire, before his fisher king sits by the river, wondering whether to get his lambs in order, Prufrock wanders beneath etherized skies, lamenting the limitations of language. He wonders, what shall I say? Do I dare to speak? He halts before the prospect of speech. Prufrock is marked by an awareness of words' insufficiency. The speaker self-consciously reflects upon the limitations of language. It is impossible to say just what I mean, the speaker says. What is the point of saying something? He seems to be saying it is to be misunderstood. What is the point of saying something if it cannot be said perfectly? What if it is to be contradicted? That is not it at all. That is not what I meant at all. Prufrock himself, in a kind of apophatic mode or mood, moves from scenario to scenario, never resting in any of them. He reflects upon the idea that there will be time for edits, time for 100 visions and revisions, which finds its analog in there being a time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. The face, too, the body in this text, is like a text susceptible of and perhaps in need of revision. Already in Prufrock, the relationship between bodies and texts in Eliot's thinking is apparent. Each is subject to a kind of imprecision or frailty. Prufrock certainly doesn't seek divinity as such, but the speaker is after a type of transcendence. The apophatic elements are all present. The canceling of speech, the pursuit of a purer language, the awareness of words' insufficiency, the desire, nevertheless, to employ language to try to get beyond ordinary language. It is the music of mythic beings, quasi-immortals, this sought, not the talk of the women who come and go. Their very coming and going being emblematic for the speaker of their unsatisfactorily transitory nature. In Prufrock, there's a clear choice between speech or speech, much as in Little Gidding, there's a choice of pyre or pyre. The language of the mermaids, whose speech, like that of the dead, is tongued with fire, is poetic, symbolic, eternal. That of the women who come and go, prosaic, merely functional, ephemeral. But will he, this ordinary man, be able to hear this poetic speech, the music of the mermaid sirens? He says, I do not think they will sing to me. For this would be the first condition of his being able to learn their song. He presumes there may be a barrier. He is a metic, an alien, not a native. Shall he ingratiate himself? Shall he roll up his trousers and walk nearer the surface? To approach the water would mean drifting away from an ordinary sort of life, would mean suffering, sacrifice, kind of ascesis. Such a step towards the sea might be a risk. But within the logic of the poem, the greater risk is seen to be remaining in the domain of ordinary human speech. It is human voices, and perhaps the ordinary human enjoyments that go with it, which represent for the poet the greater risk of drowning. Already in Prufrock, Eliot appears to have made a choice in the matter of speech or speech, pyre or pyre, having set his mind and, more importantly, his heart on the latter. Perhaps Prufrock is a love song after all, and perhaps Eliot's heart remains throughout his life, despite its inconstancy in matters of country, creed, career, and courtship, remarkably in this one way, in this desire for purity, for this longing for the language of pure poetry. In one sense, Little Giddings' Crown Not of Fire has its early analog in Prufrock's Peach, insofar as it's a kind of tantalizing possibility left dangling, unreached just off the edge of the page. But equally, Prufrock's Peach could be seen as Augustine's purloined pear, an emblem of sensual delight, almost a type of the forbidden fruit. Eschewing its flesh will be a vital part of Eliot's ascetical progress. His pilgrimage towards the fiery rose which blooms not on earth but in heaven will run directly through the fragrant gardens in which these peaches grow. Eliot leaves his alter ego Sweeney, perhaps, to send to these more earthly things, and makes his way to the chaste gardens of Burnt Norton with BVM, Blessed Virgin Mary, Emily Hale. Prufrock's unctuous pools that stand in drains are transmuted into Burnt Norton's dry pools filled with water out of sunlight. This recalls Augustine, who says that God drains dry the well of corruption in the depths of his heart, replacing these waters with sweet streams that flow from hidden springs. Eliot, like Augustine, chooses between water or water, the latter flowing from a different source and belonging to a different order of reality entirely. Eliot's choice of water or water echoes the choice of speech or speech, fire or fire. And in each case, he sacrifices the former for the latter, the lower thing for the higher. By the time Eliot begins four quartets, he's been a baptized Anglican for nearly a decade, has been deeply read in the Christian mystics, has embraced the Via Negativa. So it is not surprising that apophaticism should exert such a profound influence upon these later poems. What is perhaps more surprising is the presence of the apophatic in much more than trace evidence in Prufrock. But as Lyndall Gordon points out, Eliot, while still an undergraduate at Harvard, is already reading deeply in the mystics like St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa, Jakob Burma, and others. As Ronald Schuhart makes clear, Eliot is familiar with T.E. Hume and his thinking on original sin as early as autumn of 1950. By the time Prufrock takes its final form, Eliot has been immersed via Hume in the concept of the frailty of human flesh, a frailty that is linked in his thinking to the fallibility of language. As early as Prufrock, Eliot appears to be searching for a way beyond these twin limitations, to be exploring an apophatic impulse, a mystic impulse. He appears to be seeking after a kind of purity of expression and to be pronouncing a desire and longing for transcendence, both from the transitory conditions of the natural world and from the limitations of ordinary, prosaic human speech. And he appears to be exploring the relationship of poetry to this desire, teasing out its potential as a medium. The impulse can be glimpsed as early as 1910 when he writes The First Debate Between the Body and the Soul. Here his speaker declares, the pure idea dies of inanition amidst the withered leaves of our sensations. He laments the emphatic mud of physical sense and decries the cosmic smudge of an enormous thumb for posting bills on the soul. Already in his thinking, flesh and blood would appear to be obstacles which limit apprehension or attainment of some greater purity. At first, Eliot explicitly rejects the doctrine of pure poetry advanced by Henri Bremont in the 20s. He does so over concerns that Bremont blurs the lines between religion and literature, making of poetry something mystic and making of the mystic something subjective or man-made. Modernist Bremont suggests religion must throw off the straitjacket of theology and express its truths poetically in a way that admits of growth and development of doctrine. Here I'm drawing on Joanna Mazepa's work. And Eliot, who engages in the debate, initially takes the side of those who argue for a strict divide between poetry and religion. But he changes his position, explicitly professing in Religion and Literature in 1935 a religious purpose for poetry. According to Mazepa, the critic just mentioned, he all but assents to a modified version of Bremont's thought, offering a conditional endorsement of pure poetry by the early 30s. Given his conditional endorsement, it seems reasonable to argue that by the time he composes 4 quartets, he could himself be seeking after a kind of pure poetic speech. But long before his conditional endorsement of pure poetry in the early 1930s, as early as Prufrock and his essay Tradition and the Individual Talent, 1919, Eliot is already thinking of poetry in religious or even quasi-mystic terms. He points to a relationship between poetry and religion, not just in terms of its purpose as potential means of transcendence, but even in the way it works, its physics or metaphysics. His call for difficulty in poetry is doctrine of difficulties, kind of ascesis. For example, in Tradition, he describes the canon of poetry and how it develops in terms reminiscent of the communion of the saints, insofar as he proposes that poetry is a kind of vital corpus, subsisting in the communication across time, as it were, between living and dead poets, in which there is present a sort of mutual assistance amongst members. He even proposes a rational, harmonious order to it, which admits of growth and accommodates new members, new poets, and new works, and yet somehow remains itself. He concludes his essay, quote, proposing to halt at the frontier of metaphysics and mystery, a tacit acknowledgement that he knows the direction in which he is headed. By the time he writes Marina in 1930, we see clearly, says Joanna Mazepa, the turn in his thinking. His interest in mysticism is now woven into his poetry. Marina is a mystic poem influenced by G. Wilson Knight's reappraisal of Shakespeare. According to Mazepa, inspired by Knight's discussion of Pericles, Eliot's Marina is built around the scene of recognition, in which, according to Knight, some mystic apprehension of a life that conquers death has sprung to vivid form. She notes that this reunion with Marina must have deeply impressed Eliot as years later he singles it out. Eliot calls this scene, quote, a perfect example, a dramatic action of beings who are more than human. Eliot says, Shakespeare's skill is as bright as ever, his verse as much speech as ever, only it is the speech of creatures who are more than human. Eliot praises the achievement of a more than human speech, or to frame it in the language of this talk, kind of pure poetic speech. It is not for the first or only time that he does so. In a letter to Stephen Spender in 1931, Eliot praises Beethoven's A minor quartet, as Peter Ackroyd phrases it, for its non-human gaiety. Though the precise phrase Eliot uses is a heavenly, or at least more than human gaiety. Having returned from the dead, as it were, Marina's language is tongued with fire. It eclipses by its brightness and potency ordinary speech of the kind which frustrates Mr. J. Alfred Prufrock. In the sea-born figure of Marina, Eliot hears his mermaids singing. In his own poem, Marina, he attempts to speak their language. In the same letter to Spender, Eliot says, I should like to get something of that into verse before I die. The final lines of the penultimate stanza, let me resign my life for this life, my speech for that unspoken, expresses an apophatic urge to surrender the lower for the higher, one form of life for another, one form of speech for another. His suggestion is that the higher speech is somehow pregnant with a sublime silence. In 1933, according to Spender, Eliot said he would like to get beyond poetry, as Beethoven in his later work strove to get beyond music. There is a sense that Eliot wishes, in other words, to escape the limitations of the medium, in his case, poetry, to arrive at an utterly transcendent form of expression, something, yes, more than human. A pure poetic speech that is decidedly not, to use a phrase I'm borrowing from A.C. Spearing, the product of the blabbering, fleshly tongue. Eliot, having clearly expressed his own desire to transcend his medium, poetry, and having praised Beethoven for transcending his own medium, music, likewise expresses admiration for Massine's work, ballet, for its unhuman quality. Consistently in art, Eliot prizes expression that goes beyond the human, favoring the transcendent song that belongs exclusively to the quasi-eternal domain of Prufrock's mermaids. Robert Worthen quotes a letter from Eliot, written in 1933, where Eliot speaks of that which I long aimed in writing poetry. To write poetry which would be essentially poetry, with nothing poetic about it. Poetry standing naked in its bare bones. It is interesting that his description of nudity here, a condition which he likens to the achievement of a kind of perfect poetic expression, involves not merely the stripping away of clothing, but the stripping away of flesh. In an early poem, Silence, quote, the garrulous waves of life shrink and divide. And Eliot says, this is the hour for which we waited. Those talkative waves risk drowning out the song of the mermaids, submerging the moment when life is justified, as he says elsewhere. These are the moments in Burke Norton when the unheard music is hidden, is suddenly perceivable, when the eternal erupts into the temporal, clothed, however imperfectly in words or matter. Even though every attempt is a wholly new start and a different kind of failure, as Eliot says, the poet of four quartets seems resigned to his fate. He declares, for us, there is only the trying. The rest is not our business. This pure speech may not be attainable in this life, but striving for it may be rewarded by failures more significant than successes of the lower order. At its best, the poem can achieve a kind of midwinter spring, perhaps. In the dark time of the year, in the humble here and now, it can yield a hopeful, albeit transitory blossom, which gestures in its own way to the fiery rose, which blooms in the eternal summer beyond time. With all of this in mind, we turn to a very different poetic vision of spring and summer in the work of C.S. Lewis, and compare these competing visions in terms of the theological tension explored. We were treating this matter of this kind of tension between the vision of cosmic summer in Lewis and unimaginable zero summer in Eliot. Summer is depicted in Matthew's gospel as the fulfillment of a promise, as a state or condition of completion. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. In a similar way, Lewis describes a coming eternal summer. He says, the miracles that have already happened are, of course, as Scripture so often says, the first fruits of that cosmic summer which is presently coming on. He continues, Christ has risen, so shall we rise. And the day will come when there will be a remade universe, infinitely obedient to the will of glorified and obedient man, when we can do all things, when we shall be those gods that are described as being in Scripture. And just as in lines quoted above from St. Matthew's Gospel, Lewis, in that example, tells us that we have hints, in other words, here and now, of what is to come. There's a certain continuity between the good, true, and beautiful here and the good, true, and beautiful in eternity. There's a certain analogy, however imperfect it may be, between the here and now and the hereafter. Lewis continues, to be sure, it feels wintry enough still, but often in the very early spring it feels like 2,000 years are only a day or two by the scale. The spring comes slowly down this way, but the great thing is that the corner has been turned. Or as he writes in his poem, Chanson d'Aventure, I heard in Addison's walk a bird sing clear. This year the summer will come true, this year. And a few lines later, this year time's nature will no more defeat you. The bird alludes to the promise of an eternal summer, which is to say, the very cosmic summer Lewis speaks of above. The poem says, the summer will not lead you round and back to autumn 1 year older by the well-worn track. We are assured that this time, all these flowers foretell, we shall escape the circle and undo the spell. These words may well remind us of the spell under which Narnia is blanketed in perpetual winter, and under which summer and even the spring which would precede it are prevented for a time entirely. Quote, they had been just as surprised as Edmund when they saw the winter vanishing and the whole wood passing in a few hours or so from January to May. But he continues, they hadn't even known for certain, as the witch did, that this would happen when Aslan came to Narnia, but they all knew it was her spells which produced this endless winter. In his novel, The Great Divorce, the main character just off the bus from hell describes his first experience of heaven, saying, the light and coolness that drenched me were like those of summer morning. Lewis again associates heaven with summer. His words make something else clear as well, namely that Lewis sees continuity between the goodness and beauty which one sees here and now, the ultimate goodness and beauty which one encounters in heaven. That the spring we have here, though still wintry, still cold, gives us a faint sense of the coming season of eternal summer. And further, that we, quote, have the power either to withstand the spring and sink back into the cosmic winter, or of going on into those high midsummer pomps in which our leader, the Son of Man, already dwells, into which he is calling us. Lewis concludes, it remains with us to follow or not, to die in this winter, or to go into that spring and that summer. The choice to withstand the vital energies of spring and to sink back into winter is the precise dynamic at the beginning of Wasteland. The choice to go into spring and finally summer is the choice on display in the Chronicles of Narnia. The Wasteland begins. April is the coolest month, breeding lilacs in the dead land. And the poem continues, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. The speaker expresses a preference for the relative comforts of wintry stasis. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow. These lines at the start of Eliot's most famous poem contrast sharply with lines from Lewis's poem, The Planets, 1935, lines which almost read like they were written in response to Eliot's poem, in which he describes the lusty Venusian energies of spring, quote, in grass growing, in grain bursting, flower unfolding, and flesh longing, and shower falling sharp and aping. Lewis writes of Venus that her breasts and brow and her breath's sweetness bewitch the worlds. These are lines written as if by one who appreciates the earthy enticements of spring, the humble enticements of spring. It is arguably the frozen quality, the preference for shirking all desires, the distrust of, as he says in an essay where he debates with Eliot about Donne, heart ease as such, which Lewis says of Donne and implies of modernists, and he's pointing to Eliot there. He refers to him also as Manichaean. He's pointing to a kind of Manichaean impulse, which he mistrusts in Eliot. Narnia's transformation after the intervention of Aslan is such that it thaws into spring-like condition. And indeed, there's no mere temporary reprieve from winter, but the fulsome coming of spring. This is no thaw, says the door, suddenly stopping. This is spring. Your winter has been destroyed, I tell you. This is Aslan's doing, he says. And after the witch's fortress has been conquered, even it, the very capital of wickedness, is renewed by a spring-like sweetness. He writes, the whole castle stood empty with every door and window open, and the light and the sweet spring air flooding into all the dark and evil places which needed them so badly. It is in these spring-like conditions we see the promise of the real Narnia to come. We see in its warmth and sweetness a glimpse of that cosmic summer Lewis speaks of. The multitude of living figures who have been frozen into statues return to life in a kind of perfect analogy of this spring-like thaw. They go from stone, petrified, static, frozen in a death-like condition. For a second after Aslan had breathed upon him, the stone lion looked just the same. Lewis continues. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back, and it spread, and the color seemed to lick all over him as the flame licks all over a bit of paper. The passage concludes. Then, while his hindquarters were still obviously stone, the lion shook his mane, and all the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. He opens his great red mouth, and a warm, living, prodigious yawn issues. Here, Lewis uses the image of a flame licking the frozen surface back into living flesh. What is more, said flame does not merely dance atop a still, cold, white surface, as if on an incidental canvas. The picture of life we see here is no transitory blossom, a picture of frozen biology breathed back to fulsome life by the warm, fiery breath of spirit, such that the mouth of the thawed creature, fittingly another lion image of Aslan, is red, warm, and livid, and he fully awakens with a yawn from his forgetful sleep. He is no longer in anything like a wintry, hibernatory state. The fire, the warmth, the life is in him, not merely upon him, and he is made vital by it. Winter is vanquished with the return of Aslan. As Mr. Beaver's song promises, wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death. It continues, and when he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. Throughout the story, spring is associated with the coming of Aslan, the transformation of all conditions, the thawing of the land and its blooming. But the real Narnia entered into at the end of the last battle is a lush summer, more real than even Narnia itself. It is the home of the august lion Aslan transformed into his full regal form, which is never fully described, only mentioned. Lewis consistently sees the things of heaven, its creatures, in these summary terms. In The Great Divorce, the narrator describes an angelic inhabitant of that territory as having a light and heat, quote, like the morning sun at the beginning of a tyrannous summer day. The new and final condition is more vibrant, more alive, more dynamic, more substantial, more solid than the old. C.S. Lewis's cosmic summer is ultimately a concrete kind of cataphatic expression of the same condition pointed to in T.S. Eliot's unimaginable zero summer. Each is a kind of ultimate fulfillment, description of eternal or heavenly bliss. Eliot's summer points to the fullness of being that lies outside the round of the season, outside time's scheme, he says. It is not clothed in verdant nature. His is still somehow unapproachable, slightly distant. It is still zero, still somehow incorporeal, abstract, we might even say, merely spiritual. It does not convey the kind of substance, the warmth and magnanimity that Lewis has portrayed. In Lewis's depiction, there is a sense not just of a new heaven, but also of a new earth. They look down and see a remade and perfected England, the Diggory Kirk's house brought to its final restored state. Why, exclaimed Peter, it's England. And that's the house itself, Professor Kirk's old home. This is the true England. And the faun says, and in that inner England, no good thing is destroyed. This is the obverse point to that made in The Great Divorce, in which Lewis says, not even a souvenir of hell may be retained in heaven. But this is the positive state of the same notion. Namely, that all that was good on earth will persist. Indeed, it can't help but to persist. An even greater glory in eternity. Lewis's statement here frankly and fully acknowledges, in other words, that there is indeed goodness to be found in the here and now in our current world. Eliot's vision of the midwinter spring, which precedes his cosmic summer, foreshadows and gestures towards it, is somehow a glimpse of this final state, much like Narnia's springtime. With the coming of Aslan in line with which the wardrobe. But Eliot's summer is not in the scheme of generation. Eliot's summer is not in the scheme of generation. And neither is the midwinter spring, which precedes, foreshadows, and builds towards it. Eliot's midwinter spring has a glow more intense than blaze of branch or brazier. Lovely line. Oh, amazing. Anyway, it is alive with spirit, alive with fire, but there is, quote, no earth smell or smell of living thing. It lacks, in other words, what Lewis's depiction has, a plain, earthy ordinariness, a plain goodness. In Eliot's most arresting depiction of spring, it is not the hedgerow itself that moves, but the snow on top that comes alive with transitory blossom. This frozen scene, almost out of time altogether, its own season, as the poem says, is more strikingly alive than most any other passage in Eliot. This quasi-transcendent spring gestures to something finally utterly transcendent and beyond time and beyond imagination. His transcendent spring gestures to a transcendent summer that is so totally unimaginable that it must be called zero. It cannot be pictured. That zero summer emerges for Eliot from his midwinter spring. The one season follows from the other. And in Eliot's vision of spring, the material world is frozen, asleep, forgetful. This is not the wintry hibernation suggested by the first lines of the wasteland, but it's still a winter landscape devoid of growth and greenery. Biological life is still frozen. The world is a kind of tabula rasa for fiery spirit to dance and flicker upon. A transcendent spring alights atop a natural landscape made almost a blank white canvas. Lewis's vision of winter vanquished is central to his depiction of the ultimate condition of victory achieved by the restoration of Aslan. The emergence of spring in Narnia after the long siege of winter, after the long siege of the White Witch, who brought with her coldness and death, looks forward to and foreshadows the cosmic summer at the end of the last battle. Narnia's spring contains the seeds of its future summer. Even uncertain talk of the coming of Aslan is enough to bring warmth and hope, a psychology of spring. Even hopeful murmurs about Aslan's coming are compared to spring. Oh yes, tell us about Aslan, said several voices at once. For once again, that strange feeling, like the first signs of spring, like good news had come over. As a result, there is the hope of warmth and life even in the midst of Narnia's winter. At the end of the last battle, Lord Diggory tells Peter, but that was not the real Narnia. That had a beginning and an end. It was only a shadow or a copy of the real Narnia, which has always been here and always will be here. He says, you need not mourn over Narnia. All the old Narnia that mattered, all the dear creatures that have been drawn into the real Narnia through the door. Of course it is different. As different as a real thing is from a shadow, or waking life is from a dream. The narrator goes on to say, it is as hard to explain how this sunlit land was different from the old Narnia as it would be to tell you how the fruits of that country taste. This is an allusion to the fact that language is incapable. Here's Mr. Charismatic making an apophatic gesture. That the springtime of Narnia that they had known as a mere shadow or figure. Nevertheless, there is a distinct continuity between these two domains, the old and the new Narnia, the world before and after the end, such that the new Narnia is recognizable, even despite its surprising differences, even despite the great novelties that emerge in this condition. Quote, it was the unicorn who summed up what everyone was feeling, says the narrator. I have come home at last. This is my real country. I belong here. This is the land I have been looking for all my life. I never knew it till now. The reason we love the old Narnia is that it sometimes looked a little like this. In other words, there is continuity, even contiguity, between the old world before it had been remade and the eternal. What is more, the children were right to have loved the old Narnia, the good things there. They were right to have been provoked by a desire for it, because it pointed to the eternal Narnia to come. That which was good in it remains in eternity, or as Lewis says, only slightly different in his preface to The Great Divorce. Quote, earth will not be found by anyone to be in the end a very distinct place. Rather, earth, if put second to heaven, will be found to have been from the beginning a part of heaven itself. This statement reflects yet again Lewis's consistent belief that there is, yes, continuity, sorry for that word, between heaven and earth, between the eternal things and the good temporal things that we encounter now. Lewis captures essential differences about this eternal summer land too. They find themselves walking together up this bright procession towards mountains higher than you could see in this world, even if you have perfect vision, etc. The vision is sharper and clearer and truer, in part because we are no longer seeing through a glass of darkness in that condition. Lucy says, whatever she looked at, however far away it might be, once her eyes fixed steadily on it, became quite clear, close, as if she were looking through a telescope. And there is no snow in this new. But there was no snow on those mountains. There were forests and green slopes and sweet orchards and flashing waterfalls, one above the other, going up forever. All is transformed, transmuted. There is no longer, in other words, proximity to coldness or death. It is no longer springtime, that season, contiguous with winter, still carries something of its chill and something of the memory of the White Witch. Here, ice is melted, never again to return. A final condition. Death and frozenness are finally and completely conquered. Even Lord Diggory's beard, the narrator says, becomes golden rather than gray in this new state. All is made vibrant and vital and perfect. Lewis renders this scene concrete, giving us a glimpse of what I have not seen, but he retains a sense of mystery even here, a sense that these things can't be fully elucidated for us here and now. He's not in any way confused. The narrator, speaking of Aslan on the final page of the last battle, quote, and as he spoke, he no longer looked at them like a lion. But the things that began to happen after that were so great and so beautiful, I cannot write them down. Lewis preserves the sense that there is more besides, an ever-unfolding adventure is ahead of it. It's the ultimate dynamic encounter of this vision. It's unbelievably powerful. This eternal adventure in Lewis's rendering is kinetic, dynamic. It gives the impression of being fully and delightfully embodied as well. Eliot's apophatic vision lacks something, perhaps, of the warmth and magnanimity of Lewis's approach. It may indeed seem to lack a certain warmth or humanity. This coldness in Eliot's work finds its analog in a certain coldness in the practice of his faith. Speaking, Lyndall Gordon, biographer of Eliot, writes, Eliot's curt exposition of detachment is curiously flat, not because his aim is less lofty than the mystics, but his feeling is different. Genuine mystics show concurrent love for fellow beings, which is a sign of their state of grace. Eliot's detachment is more rigid. He seems oblivious to the effect that detachment, even of the purest kind, will have on other people. Lewis remarks in an experiment in criticism that reading enables a person to go out of the self. It is a type of transcendence. In effect, that, as Lewis tells us, it can be described either as an enlargement or as a temporary annihilation of the self. This paper argues that Eliot, in his criticism, poetry, and theology, displays a marked tendency towards renunciation and annihilation. And that in Lewis, we find a tendency, broadly speaking, towards something more like enlargement. His fiction especially shows vivid portraits of characters whose selves are utterly transformed and made greater. But critically, these depictions of enlargement in Lewis's creative works only take place after the characters' lesser fallen selves have been totally annihilated. For example, Eustace Scrubb in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, plural until we have faces. For as Lewis is well aware, transcendence of the sort described in Christian theology requires temporary annihilation in order to bring about the self's infinitely greater enlargement. For as Lewis goes on to say, this seeming dichotomy is an old paradox. He that loseth his life shall save it. Across his creative works, Lewis shows us consistently, unambiguously, and in concrete terms, that which comes after annihilation. He gives readers concrete depictions of selves, even of whole worlds, utterly transformed and enlarged. He shows us a picture of the glory that follows the gloom of what is only ever a temporary annihilation. He never, so to speak, leaves us looking up at the broken body of the cross, but shows us the resurrection and the empty tomb. The Easter following the depiction of Good Friday. In Mere Christianity, Lewis describes the theological purpose of self-annihilation, giving the example of renovation of house, really wonderful image, like he has so many, which Lewis likens to the process of the human soul being remade by God. Lewis describes God's desire to perfect the soul, using this house as an analogy. He says, the person undergoing this renovation will expect it will be a modest affair, getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof. But Lewis makes clear that God's project is vastly more ambitious than this. He would make the house perfect, not better. Lewis said God starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably. Comes as a great shock. Suddenly, all the destruction, the chaos, the annihilation, the pain leads to delightful and unexpected enlargements, to the throwing of a new wing, the putting on of an extra floor. It leads to the running up of towers and the making of courtyards. It is no humble home being built, but a palace, he tells us. And lest one should come away from this metaphor with the mistaken idea that one's true home or one's true self is destroyed by God in the process of being renovated, only to be replaced with something which, however grand, is somehow not really truly one's own, Lewis offers a clarifying analogy. He likens God's intervention to salt being added to a dish, saying that meals do not show their real taste until you have added it. He concludes, the more we get what we now call ourselves on it, and let him take us over, the more truly ourselves we become. Just as the salt brings out the true flavor of food, God brings out the true essence of the individual person. He affects the ultimate enlargement. And he not only enlarges people, he makes them more distinct, not more like each other, but more unlike each other. A bit like Aquinas says of angels. And they're so different from each other that they're almost different species. It's interesting. Indeed, Lewis says that creatures grow further apart as they increase in perfection. He continues good as it becomes continually more different, not only from evil, but from other instances of good. Lewis's The Great Divorce offers many depictions of enlargements that have followed annihilations, depictions of characters who have, having thrown off their old selves, become more distinctly and truly themselves. The book, its very title, which is an allusion to Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, explicitly challenges the notion that even any smallest portion of one's fallen self may be retained if one would seek heaven. It is still either or. If we insist on keeping hell or even earth, he tells us, we shall not see heaven. The dissevering two domains is absolute, and the absolute annihilation of one's lesser fallen self is a necessary precondition for this greater enlargement. Those who attain the ultimate prize of eternal life, quote, shall not be able to retain even the smallest, most intimate souvenirs of hell, he tells us. And for a very specific reason. These things lack sufficient substance to survive them. They are mere smoke, just shadows. In The Great Divorce, Lewis shows a vision of a heaven that is more solid, more real, more substantial, as it were, than hell or earth. The visitors from hell are as ghosts, man-shaped stains on that earth. And of course, Lewis humbly acknowledges the limitations of his own particular portrayal of the earth, cautioning readers that the transmortal conditions are solely an imaginative supposal. He's not trying to give us a picture of what actually awaits us. It's beyond his purpose to arouse factual curiosity. The reality of heaven will be far greater than this form. However, this caveat once dispensed, he then presents in the novel concrete example after concrete example of enlarged humanity, or of humanity failing in certain cases to be enlarged, the consequences of that choice. He shows us what comes after the sacrifice of self-annihilation, and alternatively, what comes after the refusal to subject the base aspects to that. The notable transformation which takes place in this book is that involving the man with a red lizard on his shoulder. The man is timid, he is described as dark and oily, which is indicative as being afflicted with the sin of lust. He's harried by this small reptile, which whispers this sort of steady stream of noxious chatter into his ear. The man's unable to break free from the small beast's influence. The angel asks him if he would like help. He says, absolutely, yes, of course I do. The angel says, then I will kill him. As the angel approaches the man to kill the lizard, the man recoils and says, whoa, hang on a minute. You're burning me, keep away. The man thinks this is just too extreme and dangerous. He begins to bargain and asking whether the lizard might just be kept quiet in the corner instead. The man wishes to make some accommodation, in other words, for the lizard, in effect, seeking a marriage between him and hell. The angel presses him, asking for his consent to kill it, making it clear that he must assent to the choice. He must willingly choose to surrender the creature. He relents even over his fear that he himself will be killed. After the creature is finally killed and flung broken back on the turf, the graphic image, it transforms into a giant stallion, silvery, with a tail and a mane of gold. Lewis's Virgil-like guide, George MacDonald, then explains the meaning of the parable, saying, lust is a poor, weak, whimpering thing compared to that richness and energy of desire which will arise when lust has been killed. Here, Lewis shows us an instance of the divorcing heaven from hell. And he doesn't just show us the death that belongs to hell, but he fleshes out a vision of this greater glory that happens afterwards. He gives it form and body and clear expression. In the last chapter, the last battle, Farewell of Shadowlands, Lewis says, Lucy says, as she figures out the relationship of the old Narnia to the new, she says, I see, this is still Narnia, and more real and more beautiful than the Narnia that we love. Aslan announces finally that they have left the Shadowlands forever. The term is over, the holidays have begun, the dream is ended, this is more. What is more, the constant rallying cry to come farther up and farther in bespeaks a state of endless adventure, condition beyond any need of further annihilations. Enveloped in this cosmic summer, it is both a condition of complete simplicity, as Eliot says in Little Gidding, and of never-ending, ever-unfolding, joyful enlargement, as Lewis depicts at the close of the last battle. Lewis offers a concrete picture of the ultimate goodness to come and retains a palpable sense that what is to come ever remains, and to our benefit, to our great benefit, a mystery still to be fully unraveled and discovered. Finally, thank you for your patience. T.S. Eliot's pursuit of a pure, more than human poetic speech and his desire to use language to go beyond language, the essence of his apathetic approach, is reflected in his work from the beginning. He longs to hear the song of the mermaids and the related dialect, the fiery tongue of the dead. And ultimately, he wishes to attempt, despite the limitations of earthbound language, to speak in his poetry this pure tongue. This culminates in his final major poem, Little Gidding. Its tongue of flame is an image of the pure Pentecostal language, the language of spirit, which the poet prefers and which he seeks. Here we see an image of Eliot's unimaginable zero summer in the concluding line of the poem. in which he alludes to a final beatific state in which the fire and the rose are one. The eternal summer which this image points to, this paper argues, is prefigured in the poem by Eliot's Midwinter Spring. Lewis's Narnian Spring and Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe prefigures his cosmic summer in the last battle, has a decidedly different concrete feel. The two distinct visions on display reflect different attitudes towards nature and the material world, and its contiguity or not with the eternal. Whilst there does not appear to be much continuity sometimes for Eliot between this world and the next, there is a striking continuity between his vision of Midwinter Spring and Zero Summer. In both, a kind of pure spirit with a tenuous relationship to the physical flickers freely, lasts joyfully unencumbered by gross matter as able to be itself. Striking as Eliot's two seasons are, they lack something, frankly, of the plain goodness and earthy ordinariness of Lewis's depictions. Eliot's crown knot of fire does not produce nearly the warmth that even a rumor coming fast and does during the depth of Narnia's winter. The call of Eliot's Zero Summer is profound but abstract, not a thing as readily heard, therefore, perhaps, as the call of Lewis's cosmic summer in the deep heart's core. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your fascinating paper. Could I just kick off the conversation? Make the following observation for Eliot. I think obviously the tenor of your talk was the superiority of Lewis over Eliot in certain respects.
Sure.
Yeah. But of course, it's interesting that they had a rather tense relationship. And presumably part of that was that Lewis himself wanted to be a great poet, and so was in a way dissatisfied being one of the greatest scholars of European civilization. Whereas Eliot, who extremely erudite, but wasn't a great scholar, was an absolutely major poet. So presumably there's a sense of envy there in Eliot, in Lewis. The second point I wanted to raise, again, since it's the center of the study of Platonism, Plotinus at one point says that sense impressions are dim intellections. So there is this continuity between the sensible cosmos and the noetic cosmos in a figure like Plotinus, who can seem almost Gnostic at times. And that's, I think, part of a tension within the Platonic tradition, which goes back to Plato and the idea of the supreme principle being sometimes the one and sometimes spoken about as the good. And we're told that in the Academy, Plato gave a lecture in which he identified the one. However, if you stress the one as a first principle is absolute unity, then of course the implication of that will be negative theology, because we are in a world of plurality, and you can it's only through a phyresis, through stripping away, you can reach that absolute unity. However, if you stress the good, the axiological nature of reality ultimately, then of course all of that which emanates, which proceeds from that prior goodness will be an image of that good archetype. So we then experience the goodness of those images. So I wonder whether part of what you're talking about is a tension within this tradition that both of them have inherited through the Christian Platonic tradition and the mystical writers and many of the poets that they both admired intensely.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I kept, sort of thinking as I was writing this and as I was reading things for it and developing the concept. But yeah, this great sort of tension. I mean, so on the one hand, the mystics want a kind of unmediated contact with the divine, unmediated by creation, a kind of pure encounter with identity, right? But on the other hand, where does that leave flesh and blood? And what does that do, frankly, with incarnation? What do we do with incarnation if we're seeking after something purely transcendent? It gets very interesting and very complicated.
And by the way, one contemporary who's very interesting in this respect is Simon Weil, who is a very much Platonist, but agnostic. I mean, her sense of the world is extremely dark and gloomy. I think that would be a much more extreme instance of what you're suggesting is there in India.
I think Beckett is a kind of extreme example in certain respects too, more extreme. And actually, there's a book by a scholar from Belfast called Sharon Jebb Smith, Writing God and the Self, where she makes a comparison between Samuel Beckett and sort of talks about this Gnostic and Manichaean kind of impulse in him, the kind of outright loathing of materiality in comparison with Lewis and the Cataphat.
Thank you. Questions? Please.
Thank you very much for a wonderful book. I have a question regarding the pure poetry of Eliot.
Yes.
So you mentioned what it was only a throwaway phrase, but I for clarification from you about mere functionality of certain kinds of speech. And I wonder if you could speak to my perhaps wrong impression, the idea of pure poetry in, say, the French symbolist tradition, say someone like Mallarmé, is centrally contrasted with the commercial, with the bourgeois, buying and selling. That's if my understanding of Mallarmé is correct, which it will not be. What's the antipode in Eliot? What's the opposite of pure poetry? Because I don't find kind of anti-bourgeois sort of, bits glittering his writing.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I think he actually he does sort of face the accusation of a kind of snobbishness on the part of many, actually. Like the name of the critic is escaping. One of the most famous guys was talking about Eliot's sort of tendency to kind of dismiss ordinary people, and in fact, it's something that I treat in the thesis. And in fact, it's a comparison I make between Eliot and Lewis, that Lewis has a kind of respect for the ordinary. He says that he sometimes respects ordinary people more than scholars in certain instances. And of course, there are biographers who say that's pose. And maybe to an extent it's kind of nasty. But no, I think Eliot does. There is a kind of a tang of elitism about it. And actually, that's where that kind of Gnostic label, he might wear that indeed. There is a sense that, like where he talks about only the great poets may comment upon Milton and things like that. He's reserving to himself as a kind of, a member of a special priest class, the ability to form opinions on a given topic and excluding other people. There is, at times, risk of being overly, it sounds like I hate him, I don't. He does actually have kind of elitist tendency. In the name of that critic, I will come to you about. So, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your. I love the way you wove at the very early Eliot and late Eliot. I was just wondering, in relation to your question there too about putting them through, whether there is, I suppose, in relation to Eliot's relation to pure poetry, there's also his lifelong fascination and flirtation with poetic drama, with the prospect of writing for bodies and voices, which seems to be, I mean, as you know, the four quartets began with a rejected fragment of Murder in the Cathedral. So I wonder whether there's still in the shape of the poem a kind of memory of that fascination with poetic drama, which stages, I think, sometimes a dramatic self-consciousness of pure poetry. That these moments which you cited with this kind of gorgeousness. There's also that sort of, that was one way of putting it, not very satisfactory. Then the poem sort of has this movement, that I think there might be a kind of skepticism of poesy creole kind of woven into its compositional history, especially as Eliot revises things in 1939, and purity, of course, these awards comes to have, a darkness to it. Or the essay in the music of poetry where he talks about the music of the word being at a point of intersection.
Yeah.
Of course, I think what you say about India not really being able to robotics is true. But that there's a kind of memory of the desire for drama, for polyphony, which is not entirely purity, or
Yeah, I can offer nothing to improve upon what you've just said. Other than that, it's something to be considered.
And I suppose in your juxtaposition, even there's raising this question of, well, as Douglas mentioned as well, of the role of the pathetic. C.S. Lewis writing in a different genre,
Yes.
but writing for character, for body.
Yeah, but that's absolutely the case. And of course, they're obviously writing for very different audiences.
Yeah.
It's for children, but we have to remember that Lewis is also, he's considered by some scholars to be like the most important public philosopher of the 20th century.
Yeah.
So he's also writing on that level for people.
Yeah.
Also an academic.
Yeah.
And even there, it tends to be, this cataphatic impulse is still present.
Yeah.
In one chapter, I kind of compare the prose level writings and their debates over literary critical debates over key texts, and talk about like their clash over Hamlet and their clash over Donne.
Yeah, there's so many.
Yeah. So that's I kind of toyed with the idea of doing that, or maybe this bit I wasn't sure anyway. But yeah, I mean, I see what you mean. So it's the short thing to say.
And I think it relates beautiful phrase you have about Eliot about being a sort of like his work being like a body and vision.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, the idea. And of course the vision that he has, winning all the other kind of right?
Yeah.
And then writing drama. Yeah. Body, very, very interesting. Thank you.
So we've got a number of questions, and they're all kind of. So if I can go from the back here, and then Cole, then yeah.
In the slightly related question, since it's about his drama, is that in the rock, Eliot is so Eliot certainly speaks then about the physical building of churches as something that's very much a reflection, manifestation even of something spiritual.
Yes.
How would you?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for raising that, because I think at times I've gestured, at least in Lewis's case, the fact that he is not purely cataphatic, obviously. And certainly Eliot is not purely kind of apathetic, either. Yeah, indeed, Eliot, I'll go one even better. His depiction of Christ, where he sees him sort of as being baptized in the River Jordan, it's like very concrete, it's very vivid, it's very direct depiction of divinity. So yeah, it's not a matter of, and obviously, well, really any poet, if you at the end of the day is kind of cataphatic, right? They're using language, they're casting things in words. They are speaking, even if they would wish to sort of speak a purer tongue, they're still saying something. If they're not saying nothing. Yeah, so you're right. Absolutely. There is that in the man. It's not purely sort of being negative. Thank you.
So Cole, and then
my question is sort of going along the vein of the previous few. So I'm wrong, I'm by no means an Eliot scholar, but in his essay on Hamlet, he supposes this idea of the objective correlate, and he very famously deems Hamlet an artistic failure.
Yes.
Specifically because his idea, his picture of good art is wrapped up in the success or failure of the intentions of the artist.
Yeah.
And specifically in instilling emotions in people and bodies. And so for his critique of Hamlet, in some senses,
I see what you mean.
is Shakespeare successfully describes emotion, but maybe it doesn't instill in the body. And so I wonder if you see this motivation or intention in the objective correlate as attempting to bring together body and word in some way, and you see that with the quartets. I think I like the quote from the Lindahl Gordon biography. I think it's Beethoven's Fifth or something, where he says, "I'd like to get something of that into Posey someday." Perhaps what he's getting at is there's an intentionality in the music that he would like to sort of bring the reverse into the music of the quartets specifically.
Yeah.
So that's my first question. My second question is just a really quick literary one. Why do you think that Lewis and the Planets and Eliot and the Wasteland are paraphrasing Chaucer's prologue? What do you think that has to say about the intentionality of each poem in that sense?
To that second question, I don't really have anything to say to that. That's the first point. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, the objective correlative, right? It is an attempt to embody an ideal, right? Indeed, one of the key debates that Lewis and Eliot have is over that very text. Lewis says that, Eliot says that it is most certainly an artistic failure. One of the reasons that he calls it an artistic failure, the objective correlative, of course, but he also talks about the way in which Shakespeare, I'll just paraphrase it, attempted to express something inexpressible. Attempted to express something that could not be expressed, which is very interesting. It sort of suggests that there again is, in Eliot, this kind of preoccupation with the incapacity or frailty of language. But as to your point about the objective correlative, that is an embodied. He's at the same time complaining that they haven't embodied this, they haven't made this sort of concrete enough. Anyway, I see what you're saying. It's a very interesting point. Sorry, I can't answer the Chaucer question.
Thank you very much for your talk. Forgive me for picking up one of the minor threads, but I was really interested by your throwaway remark that Mr. Cataphatic isn't gesture, which, if I think correctly, was talking about the limitations of language in Narnia. I just found it really interesting because when you were talking about Eliot earlier, a lot of the quotes you were giving sounded to me very Lewisian. In a lot of Lewis's works, you were talking about Brick Divorce, he was very modest about the attempts to try to do things.
I agree.
And in others of them, like We Have Faces, you talked about, so babbling speech of the person is effectively the mark of judgment in that person in the divineness. It also then when you're talking about the communion of the saints, with the idea of communion with the dead, and again, there was really and I was just interested as to why you think that the limitations of language can be, of course, meeting between these two writers are different. Why is it that someone like Lewis, who say is happy with the ordinary and the material, is still very modest when it comes to speech and language? And why is it someone like Eliot, who thinks silence is fine?
The irony is about. I mean, absolutely. I suppose for me, my way of looking at it anyway, people may not agree, but my way of looking at it is that the kind of predominant disposition in Lewis is to take the way, the positive way. It is to offer concrete descriptions of things. It is to put things kind of plainly and concretely. And I think for Lewis, the thing kind of clearly expressed, and that expression can even be the fact that language is imperfect. He says it plainly, and he says that he just tends to have a kind of there's a sense in him where a thing kind of clearly expressed doesn't lose its mystery. He sort of brings you to the point of mystery through clear expressions of things. And I think for me, at least, Eliot does something like the opposite. He does it through abstraction and through difficulty and through the kind of, a much less kind of straightforward presentation of his language. He brings you to the point of mystery in that. So I guess that's what I'm saying. If that makes sense.
Do you know, by the way, the name of the church in Harvard Square where Eliot has a mystical experience?
No, but that's a fact. He commemorates that in his poem Silence, where he talks about, this is a fascinating episode. I read about this in the thesis. He talks about, it's like he's in Harvard, he's at Harvard, he's walking the streets of Boston, and all of a sudden the streets shrink and divide. And he has this kind of mystical experience where, through the kind of almost the disappearance of material, he has this kind of sublime joy and silence. He says it's terrifying, but it's when things disappear from him, he has this kind of divine content. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, that contrasts pretty significantly with C.S. Lewis's own mystical experience. He has a very cataphatic, if you will, mystical experience. He sees in his home in East Belfast, he sees these in summer. He sees these flowering red currant bushes, and all of a sudden it just brings him back in his mind to this time at his old house as a little child when he and his brother Warnie played with this little moss-covered biscuit tin. And he said, as long as he lives, this little humble diorama of nature will always be something, and it will always be his image of paradise in his mind. So it's interesting that through nature, in the first instance, and then nature reminding him of artifice, of human art, that through this, he has this kind of mystical experience. It seems to be very different than Eliot seeing sort of material things disappear and having a divine encounter.
Right. So, Matthew, you wanted to...
Yes. So it seems like in the way that you draw the contrast between Eliot and Lewis, what seems central to Lewis's ability to sort of reconcile the empathetic and the cataphatic is like the centrality of the incarnation,
yes,
death and resurrection, and so forth. Whereas Eliot, at least, so I'm absolutely unversed in Eliot, so pardon me, but like Eliot, from your telling, seems to be sort of permanently stuck in that pre-Christian Platonic mold of like anticipating but not being able to achieve like the last end of whatever it is that he's working on. So I mean, but of course, Eliot is a Christian, right?
Yes.
Like, so how does the incarnation affect the way in which he engages with things?
Yeah, I wanted to say.
Why can Lewis make so much more use of it?
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's something I've been kind of struggling to kind of figure out because frankly, at times it seems to me that Lewis is just so incarnational in his thinking. I mean, he even talks about, what does he say that? What's the exact phrase? He says that, and Malcolm Gates always quoting this, it's wonderful. He says that imagination is a truth-bearing faculty, right? There's this idea that human constructs and art and thoughts and images can sort of bear ultimate truth, and that's kind of an incarnational principle in a way. No, but I wonder actually that very thing about Eliot, and actually I think Lewis does too. He sort of hints at, in their debate over John Donne, the fact that there is a tendency in modern literary criticism towards a kind of, he says, Manichaean mistrust of joy and harmonies as such. So they go back to the anti-physical. He's kind of pointing the finger at Eliot. He kind of means to implication. Of course, the Gnostic impulse is to see this real strict divide between material creation and divinity. Incarnation is in the part of it. I mean, I'm certainly not saying that T.S. Eliot is Manichaean or Gnostic or anything like that. I just think that he's so ascetical, he's so kind of via negativa, that sometimes he almost leans over the line and ends up in a kind of Gnostic, there's kind of a Gnostic territory. Yeah, does that make any sense?
It's a follow-up question. I wonder, you remarked on the difference of their greatness as poets, and like it seems like I would agree. Like, Lewis is not like the most sublime poet. He kind of doesn't let poetry get in its own way. Whereas, like to be a great poet, I guess maybe, especially this side of heaven, is like to reach more deeply into death. And in that case, I mean, well, would you think that's sort of
Well, and as Professor Headley was saying, of course, this is one of the major bones of contention between these two men. I mean, Lewis actually says that, and this is in a letter to his father, who has a very strained relationship with him. He says that T.S. Eliot has basically ruined his own ambitions as a poet, because he's so shifted the taste. He's created the taste by which he is to be relished, right, through his criticism for his poetry, right, and he's so shifted the landscape and so dominates it that you can't write the kind of thing that Lewis would have written and did write, and it didn't sell, and nobody read it, and nobody really cared for it. He's just not the poet that probably doesn't, and this is a very sore spot for him. In fact, it's kind of, it nags him for decades. He finally says he gives up the spear. He's like in this kind of moment where it's not that he ever agrees with that exactly, but he's just like, I love them. Walter Hooper says that at the end of his life, Lewis says, I never liked the man's poetry. And this is even after they became kind of friends. And he said, but at the end of the day, not the end of the day, he said, in the end, I came to love them. Just kind of, it's a catastrophic ending, a kind of happy ending. It's like,
Well, I think that's probably an appropriate moment to thank our speaker for a very stimulating and rich talk.